Hello, good morning. Hi, my name is Bruno. I'm really excited to be here. I apologize on my behalf for the color scheme. I had little to do with it, and you guys will need to bear with this. And apparently, it will look nice in the video recording. That's what I heard. So you can always check it, and I will share the slides, of course. I'm gonna talk about DevSecOps and threat modeling, and how can you go from DevOps towards DevSecOps in your teams or in your companies. Um, Quick note about myself: I work in a company called Futurize. Futurize is software engineering and innovation consultancy spread across Europe. We like to say that we have Nordic roots, global mindset. We were founded in Helsinki, Finland. We are spread mostly in the Nordics and in Central Europe, and we are a family of companies, and we have been growing 30% year over year. We have more than 10 years existence. Quick words about myself. I'm a principal architect and technology advisor. I work mainly in architecture, cloud, DevOps, security, and AI, and they are very broad domains, I know. Um, um, I, I'm a Portuguese native, but I've been living in Helsinki, where I'm based, for the past 7 years. Um, and I really love coffee, and I like to say it because you probably I don't. I never, it's my first time in Copenhagen, so if you know really good coffee places, please let me know. Especially espresso. As a Portuguese, that's my Achilles heel. Um, I like music, traveling, and indoor climbing. And feel free to reach me either in person. I will be here the 2 days, but or via Twitter or via LinkedIn. Uh, so when we think about DevOps and DevSecOps, and actually if you Google the terms, what are the words DevOps and DevSecOps, you will find these two quotes. And I found them, they're like in the top two. And I find them very interesting um, because they mention something that I always been uh, considering, which is that they, on the DevOps, AWS mentioned about the tooling and the culture and the practices. And then on the DevSecOps, the tools are actually not mentioned, and it's basically the emphasis goes to the philosophy or the culture, creating a security as code, the culture, a security culture within the teams. And I think that they really nailed that part. I think that that is extremely important. So I would like, before we deep dive into threat modeling, I would really like for us to explore a bit security in DevOps. And we all saw this Venom chart, probably. This is very well known. Uh, it doesn't really tell much actually to technical people. I mean, if you look at it, you see that, DevOps, you have software engineering, quality assurance, security, operations. You bundle them together and have a beautiful thing called DevSecOps. I know that in practice it doesn't work that way. In practice, this is a myth, it's a unicorn, but it allows us to reflect on a couple of things. And one thing is that roles have been changing, meaning that, the first time I started to hear people with job descriptions like DevOps engineer, SRE, or um, those terms to me were a bit vague. To me, I always thought it was buzzwords. I mean, crap is the same, the smell might be different. That was my first type of impression of that. And I'm very skeptical and cynical about this. But then over the years, I've been actually thinking a lot about that. And I will invite you to reflect a bit on this with me. If you look the roles systems administrator and network engineer, they change dramatically over the course of 5, 10 years. We used to have network engineers, we still do in certain areas, of course, but we used to have network engineers that were focusing a lot on the physical hardware, the physical switches and routers, cabling. Um, and now with cloud infrastructure, we have software-defined networks. Same with sysadmins that, you always had this physical servers and still the racking and the cabling and installing operative systems in OS. And setting up an infrastructure used to take like days, months. And with the rise of the cloud, it came also infrastructure as code. So everything became as code. And naturally, those roles stopped existing or exist less. And those roles became mostly now DevOps engineer and site reliability engineering. But if you look also quality engineering, also that role changed. It used to be that QEs were only focusing on testing the code. And nowadays, they need to know a lot about cloud infrastructure, how the things actually are spawned into AWS or Google Cloud or whatever. And they need to understand the system as a whole. So that role also been changing. They are more focused on the reliability of the system rather than if the code has some bugs. And even on developers, and we heard like really good talks during earlier today about focusing about DevOps and developer. But to me, actually, developer is a bit dead in the sense that nowadays it's becoming more common to call it software engineering. They are not the same thing because the developer is mainly focusing on the code and the code itself, while the software engineering is focusing on things, and I see a man there smiling, like the 5% of ops or any other things. Now, if you think about the InfoSec and the security, and on the previous slide when they were defining that DevSecOps, you have security teams that were now being part of the DevOps team, but most of the companies actually don't have security teams. Most of the companies, if they are lucky, they have one guy, which is the InfoSec guy, if they are lucky. Most of the companies actually don't even have that. That is the most common scenario. And usually this InfoSec person is either the InfoSec manager or can be a chief information security officer or chief information officer, but it's usually one guy. And if we are lucky. And so how can we actually be expected to do security in the day-to-day? It's kind of unbearable to think like, if we only have one security guy, how can I, that I don't know anything about security, I'm interested in the topic, how can I actually take things from that domain into my day-to-day life? And earlier days, or earlier years, we actually saw that you were developing a feature, and when the InfoSec guy came, it was already a bit too late, meaning that he came on the last mile before the release. And it is a bit like what's happening now. Because right now, I'm like 20 minutes away from you guys having lunch. So I'm the security guy trying to preach you about security while you want actually to have lunch. Now, think about that. It doesn't really, I hope that's not the case actually, but in any case, I'm not preaching as well, I hope. But if you think about what's been really, really happening is that we stop being these individuals with these roles that were very I-shaped roles, which I have this expertise. I'm a developer, I only code. Then there's a guy that's a QE, I only do tests. Or I'm an ops guy that I only take care of the databases and the servers, etc., etc. We start being T-shaped type of individuals. We started to be people that are more generic, meaning that yes, we still spend maybe 80% of the time as developers, coding, but we have 5%, 20% of our time being spent in things that are actually not core to our role as developers, meaning that we actually horizontally, we start having a bit more skills and competences. We start to, if you are a developer and you are using AWS, you start to have some skills on cloud infrastructure and how to build those, how to build automation, how to build the tests. And so my hope is that in the next 15 minutes, I will give you some bases that can allow you to expand your horizontal bar to have a bit of security, and you start having a bit of security in your minds in your day-to-day. Not 80% of your time, unless you really, really want to, but that you at least have some tools, and that tool will be threat modeling, that could get you started taking security practices in your day-to-day. Now, threat modeling is not a new thing. Threat modeling is actually a really, really old thing in security in the InfoSec world. And threat modeling, and I really like this definition from OWASP, is that it works to identify, communicate, and understand threats and mitigations. And it's a very simple definition, and it might sound a bit vague if you are not in the info security world, but it's not a tool per se. It's not a software. It's a process, and as a process, there's multiple methods, and there is actually more than 4 methods that are listed there. There's a lot more, but to me, my personal favorite is the stride, and why I like the stride so much, it's because it's really, really easy to start with, and it's also very easy to see the results. Now, you can use pretty much any method that you want, and you actually have methods that are more focused on privacy, for instance. You can also use stride as a method with some privacy features, let's call it like that, as part of the method. So you can extend that. But if you never heard about threat modeling and stride, allow me to introduce you what stride actually means. And stride is an acronym. As an acronym, it stands for spoofing, temporary repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So stride is only, the term stride is used as a mnemonic for you to memorize these terms, and I still have difficulty in memorizing it after many years of doing it. That's why I looked at the screen. So you don't be worried if you don't memorize it now. I've been doing this for years and I still didn't memorize them all. But the funny part is that this works really, really easy in practice. It's so easy that it's scary how easy it is to actually start with stride. Picture stride as a workshop format. You don't have to do it as a workshop, but workshop is a really, really nice way to do it. And you first start by identifying actually what do you want to threat model about. Now, if you are developing a service, you can threat model the entire service, or you can threat model parts of the service. And more focused allow you more insightful discussions rather than more superficial discussions. So the more focused it is, and the more clear the boundaries it is, the more effective will be your threat modeling session. And so after you define what you want to threat model, and as an example, I think we all know, or at least we know if you are using AWS or cloud, you probably heard the term Bastion host. And a Bastion host is basically a server that you are exposing to the internet to allow you and your team to use it as a gateway to connect to your internal services. So if you are in AWS and you have, for instance, some Linux instances running, and they are in a private subnet, you need to find a way to reach them. And the way to reach them is that you have one of these servers, let's call it a special server, that is as a public IP that you use to jump in and SSH to others. So starting with that really, really simple example, this is what we together are going to threat model here. Not in an extensive way, obviously, but just as an example. So after we define what we want to threat model, and I want us to threat model that Bastion host that's there in the corner, and this is the architecture diagram for it. I took it from Amazon website. I didn't make it myself. We need to find who is relevant to that threat modeling. And usually it is that you have the team that developed the system. You also invite who uses that system. Sometimes might be or might not be the team. In case of the Bastion host, most likely is actually the team. But you also invite on a service or a product, you invite product owners. You invite the architect, and you have someone to facilitate that type of workshop. Now, the facilitator of that workshop needs to be, or should be as neutral as possible. And when I say as neutral as possible is that you usually don't want your Scrum Master or your architect to be actually the facilitator of that, because they will be biased in the way that they will create the questions. And usually. So you need to actually have, if you are submerged into a particular project, you need to actually have a couple of years experience on doing a lot of threat models to gain this type of neutrality or being agnostic. So invite someone that, for instance, from other team to do it with your team, someone that actually doesn't know your system, or an external facilitator, of course. Now, how you do it, picture as a workshop format, 2 to 3 hours. It can be more, but more it will lose, it will not be as effective. If you do it smaller than that, you will not be insightful enough. I usually tend to do it every 3 to 6 months, but it can be done every month in the end of the sprint if you want. But it's a very mentally exhaustive process. And the way that you do it is that you will take all those terms from Stride, and you are going to iterate over them. So for each of those terms, the facilitator will ask questions in the mind of an attacker. So in the mind of an attacker, I will make questions for you that develop the system to reflect how the system will react to it. And usually the outcomes of in each term, you will actually have more questions than answers. But you will have, for instance, things that will be that, oh, okay, we need to change the architecture over there. That doesn't really make sense. Or we need to create this type of feature. Or we actually need to remove that part completely. So the outcomes vary a lot, but it might also be that you actually don't get a concrete answer for that question, and you actually might need to investigate certain detail. So don't be afraid of raising questions that you know that there will be no answer immediately to it. So everyone can actually make the questions, but the facilitator needs to kickstart the discussion. And you only move to the next term after you exhaust every question that you might possibly have as a team in the first one. So how this works in practice. So taking our bastion host, and taking spoofing, which is the first one. And spoofing is essentially to pretend to be something or someone that you are not. So on a bastion host works in the way that our team can SSH to it, and then from that it can SSH to other things. So first question is, how are we authenticating the users? Are we using SSH keys? Are we using passwords? If we are using, well, we are using one of them for sure, but how are they getting populated into the bastion host? Who creates them? How can an attacker, if we are using SSH keys, inject his key into the system? Or are the keys being regenerated every once in a while? So if, for instance, my key gets leaked to the internet, for how long will stay exposed? How can I actually, if I log into the system, a valid user, I'm logging into my bastion host, can I somehow impersonate you as a colleague? Can I actually sudo to your account or something like that? So those are the questions typical questions that will be made for a system like this. Now, when we exhaust all the questions for spoofing, and let's say that we already exhausted because we need to move forward with the presentation, we move on to tampering. And tampering is to manipulate or to change information that you are not really supposed to. So picture it as I logged into the system. Can I actually go and change your password, someone else's password on the system? Or can I log into the system and just elevate myself and change things that I was not supposed to? Because I'm a junior developer and I'm actually not supposed to change things at that level on that system because it's a production system. It needs to go through version control to apply those changes. Questions like that, can I actually manipulate things that I'm not supposed to? Can I elevate my privileges in a way? Or repudiation. Can I actually, do I have the ability to claim that I didn't do certain actions, despite the fact if I did it or not? Meaning that if I logged into the server and I wipe out the contents of the server, how will my team know that, hey, this account logged in and clear up the server? Are we logging that information for audit purposes? And those are the questions that you need to do. Or if someone say like, hey, this happened and this was you, will I have a way to say that, no, it wasn't me? It's not a matter of assigning blame here, but we need to know, we need to have the data to back up that type of information. It's not a matter of blaming, it's a matter of us, for auditing purposes, to know what happened. So, and by knowing what happened can also mean to retrace steps. It can also mean that something happened, I want to know how that happened. That wasn't supposed to happen. So can I retrace the steps of a person that attacked the system? And information disclosure, and this is actually quite one of the very interesting topics that touches a bit the privacy. Now, in our Bastion hosts, you might think it's a dumb Linux server. And your first question is that, is this information sensitive? And you say like, no, it's a dumb Linux server. Now, the thing is, that server can access certain services. Is the information that dumb server can access, is that information sensitive? Meaning that, can I log in, or any of you can log into this Bastion host and directly from there connect to a database and expose all the information of that database to the internet? Can I create a tunnel, even by accident? So those are the type of questions like, how can we actually mitigate that we are not exposing information to the internet by accident or intentionally? And this might mean that we, for instance, put some network access control lists around that subnet, that we put any kind of like firewall in the server. So it can mean a lot of those methods to mitigate. Then denial of service, which is to prevent the service to actually function. So, and in a Bastion host means that what happens if our Bastion host is not there? Meaning, what is the impact to our business? How long can we actually afford, business-wise, to be without that Bastion host? So picture, for instance, in the case of an attacker, that the system, that Bastion host is getting DDoS. So no one can actually access that. Does that mean that our team will not be able to work the entire day because they cannot log into instances in the internet? And if so, how can we mitigate that? Can we actually do we need high availability? So this is like the type of question that will raise based on denial of service. Then elevation of privilege. It means that gaining rights to do things that I'm not supposed to. It actually, in our case, the Bastion host could be how easy it is to me to go to the server and escalate myself to root. Or how easy it is to me to actually go to the server and log in to another instance as an administrator, as root. So those are the type of questions that we'll raise from here. And after you go through all this slide, you will get some notes. But this is just one way to do threat modeling. And you can actually make this a lot different. You can make this fun. I actually learned recently that there is actually card games for that. One of them is called Elevation of Privilege, and it's actually open source by Microsoft. And that gentleman called Adam was the guy in Microsoft that actually was involved on that project. So you can actually go to the Microsoft website and actually download the entire card game and then print it yourself, or you can buy already printed, and it will look like this. So you actually, if you want to actually check it, you can. I actually ordered this. It arrived 2 days ago, so I barely actually saw it. But basically, this follows the stride method, and it allows you to make this a bit more interactive. So it might actually help you to facilitate this type of exercise in your company. And I actually discovered that there's a lot of security games, and I was very impressed by that. Not all of them about threat modeling, but actually Adam has in his website a huge list. This is only like one part of that, of the security games. And they always have like really, really weird and yet funny names like Dungeons and Data and things like that. So go and check it, at least for inspiration in names. It's really nice. And so what we get out of a threat modeling? We get the backlog with findings for us to either investigate or new work that was uncovered, new features that we need to do. So yes, this will generate you more work. Yet you actually will gain a lot because you actually, if you make this frequent enough, it will force you to have architecture diagrams or flow diagrams up to date, which we all know that documentation is always our weakest point, that we never manage to keep the things up to date. So this is actually a byproduct, is actually you end up getting your documentation in a really, really nice and updated way. Also for compliance reasons, if you ever done work with GDPR and if you have to fill this privacy impact assessments, you know that there's like one special section in hell which is says like, did you do threat modeling? Please give me all the findings that you did in each session. And so you can actually use this for compliance reasons to say like, yes, we did threat model, we do threat model our service often, and here are all the findings from all the sessions. So it actually, in a way, it's kind of a cover my ass type of policy, because it actually indicates to your users that you are actually taking security serious, and actually you might have found certain things and actually you are dealing with that. So threat modeling will actually help to identify the weakest points, even though you might not be able to fix them right away, but you will need to address them. Also, one really nice thing is the alignment within the team. I found that by running this exercise, especially when you have product owners involved, you actually get the developers to really, really understand the use case, the business use case. And that is really, really invaluable. Usually when we are coding, we don't really interact that much with our end users. We do that via a product owner. And even with the product owner, we might not interact that frequently. So by doing this and guiding this through how a user or a rogue user will use our system, we actually end up having a more clear vision about our business. And if you need this to memorize what each term means, there's a small thing there that you can just crop and use if you want. I will share the slides with you, but that's what I have to say. Thank you.